That's right.
Right.
It's heavily concealed, and I go into detail as to how the colonel says it was concealed in the book. What I can tell you is that with now I personally went off of the eastern slope and did research there, and more recently, Norio Hayakawa. As a matter of fact, last month Norio was out there with his own team, trying to locate the Security Auxiliary TAD2, which is right there off of County Road. I think it's 375.
Okay, fair enough. But for the interest of time, let's get back to this facility. Try to describe the picture for us. When I'm thinking of this facility and all the legends and the myths, I mean, you sat down with a guy who spent a lot of time there. I'm thinking underground cities. I'm thinking 7 layers, 7 levels of different floors and biolabs and all kinds of...
massive in size. That very, very, very massive in size and very, very cavernous. There's an endless number of corridors that actually make up the facility.
So he validated everything I just said, basically, correct?
Absolutely.
How many people work at this facility?
On average, there were now I've got to remember this is 26 years ago.
Okay.
There were on average 1,500 people that made up the entire contingent of the facility. The majority of them were contractors who were working through federal contractors. Working on through like Bechtel, Rand Corporation.
Anthony, how do they keep people silent? Thousands of people who have passed through this facility, this top secret facility. How did they keep them silent that we have one gentleman that we can count on one hand? I've talked to George Knapp about this too. How can we bring our hand up and count on one hand people who have come forward, whistleblowers, about Area 51 or places like Dulce? I want an answer to that when we come back. We're going to get into that. We're also going to get into the technology that exists at this base and the overall malevolence that the colonel is afraid about. That and your questions and comments. This is UFOnaut Radio on KPAM 860.
9 to 10 every Saturday night. UFOnaut Radio with Jesse Randolph on KPAM 860.
With Anthony Sanchez, author, researcher of the Dulce interview. Welcome back, Anthony. When we last broke, I was asking you about if the colonel had made any remarks about how they can keep so many people who work in this virtual underground facility, this city underneath the ground at Dulce, New Mexico. How do they keep them quiet?
That's the question that I actually asked the colonel, because it just perplexed me that you would have this large contingent of people. It came down to several things. The first one being economics. Imagine like a research scientist who would normally make $45,000 a year, who was instead making $250,000 a year, with all the benefits of a major corporate entity.
Well, we know that buys plenty of silence. That's a good point.
Right. So economics is the first one. The second one is, working under threat. Working under, personal safety is a big consideration, especially when you consider the fact that DSD-3, which is the security, the security division that operates the Dulce facility, essentially, is using essentially conditioning processes that were adopted directly from the CIA, MK Ultra, no less. So,
there's a lot of personal issues that you need to worry about with connection to your own safety of both yourself and your family, correct?
That's right. Once you're inside and you're, to have gotten there, would have meant that you already met a specific profile.
Okay, so the colonel obviously had reached a point in his life. Sometimes it's a deathbed confessional. Sometimes it's just the fact that you've had enough of keeping these dark secrets hidden inside that have been giving you nightmares for God knows how many years. I don't know how anyone could live with a secret like this. Let me ask you this. Number one, how did you get the colonel to agree to do lie detector tests? And those tests, talk a little bit how they were conducted and the findings.
That was my prerequisite. I mean, I
Good for
wouldn't
you.
touch this. You have to understand, I had already spent so much money traveling, researching, conducting interviews, over the years for, the purposes of putting my book together. And at the point when the colonel had contacted me in January of this year, I was very, 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 apprehensive about spending any more money on anything with regards to the book. In particular,
Well, who paid for the tests?
I paid for the test.
You personally paid for them.
I personally paid for the test.
Okay,
So
and why multiple tests? What was wrong with just one?
I had two sets of questions that I had asked. One, so the first set of questions that were architected was specifically about his profession.
Okay.
And his history.
And how did he do?
This guy is exactly who he says he is.
You passed with flying colors.
Flying colors. The second set of questions were architected such that the colonel knew he was talking specifically about Dulce. Specifically.
So one of the tests I think you described, the examiner does not know about Dulce, correct?
That's right. On both the tests, he doesn't know about Dulce.
See, I think that was a really smart thing to do.
I had to.
Well, it was genius, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I had to because we're talking about when you read the book and you learn about this COM-12 organization and you learn about, people that have been murdered.
Well, think about it this way, Anthony. When you have hypnotic regression of someone, the regressionist knows what they're searching for already.
That's right.
Okay, but if they didn't, you're talking about a whole new layer of impartial, correct? Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting that you decided to do that. So the colonel passes with flying colors. Now let's get to the meat and potatoes of some of the things that really threw you for a loop, because here you are sitting there with this gentleman. He's gotten cleared for takeoff, basically, because he's passed his tests, right? He's legitimate. You finally have the golden fleece in your lap. And he wants to talk to you mostly about genetics. Why?
Because the majority of the work that holds any importance that takes place there has everything to do with genetics on multiple levels. If you're familiar with the area in general, you'll know that there's a high volume of cattle mutilations that take place within a 1,000-mile radius of Dulce. I mean, especially when you go over towards the San Luis Valley in southern Colorado. I mean, this whole area is known for cattle mutilations.
Correct.
And that was a key. That was a key for me. I did a lot of research on Linda Mouton Howe,
sure.
Gabe Valdez, a lot of these people that had, really put together some amazing, facts on these cattle mutilations. And turns out a lot of the cattle mutilations are being conducted by, initially they were being conducted by the Greys for purposes of sustenance. You read about that in the book.
Sustenance, did you say?
Yes.
Oh, my.
Yeah.
Okay. Continue.
And with respect to, glandular extractions, and they don't eat like humans eat. It's a different ballgame altogether.
Explain.
Well, in 1956, there had been an incident where they had abducted a human off of a military base, and they had done a human mutilation, and that had triggered again another event that almost caused a complete breakdown in relations between the scientific efforts that were taking place between the Greys and the military. After that, they had come to an accord where they were no longer allowed, obviously, to abduct humans, and instead they were, instructed to, abduct cattle, which was not really fair to the local ranching community there, because a lot of families were devastated.
But you're saying, basically, if I'm reading this right, that the reason for cattle mutilation in the area was for feeding.
By the Greys, but
by
not by the military. By the military, it was a completely different.
Well, yeah, they just went down to the supermarket, I would imagine, correct?
Well, yeah, not for purposes. No, I'm talking when the military conducted these cattle mutilations. One, they were facilitated by the use of Grey technology. Two, it was done solely for the purposes of testing chemical bioagents like anthrax and ricin. To see the effects on, a large mammalian population.
Okay.
Because then they could then.
I gotta cut you off here because we're running out of time. I guess we're gonna have you back. I already told you that before we started. So if you're listening tonight, this is only part one of this fascinating story, because there's no way that we could get We just scratched the surface, Anthony.
Would
you agree?
Absolutely.
Okay, so let me ask you this in closing to wet the whistle for part 2, if I could, which is the following. The Colonel claims that there are dark, malevolent activities involved with this location, and what really bothered me, or I think it was hard to digest, was that the Colonel expressed that the humans were in control. They were in control, and there were dark things going on there. Talk a little bit about that. We've got about maybe a minute for you to discuss that.
There was a facility that was constructed in this portion of Carson National Forest called Leandro Tank. There's just a water abatement that is used for the dumping of toxic chemicals that are coming out of a facility called TAD3. That is the scientific auxiliary where they're conducting super soldier programs. They are abducting humans and using these humans for the purposes of these super soldier programs.
But it all comes back to genetics. It all comes back to genetics.
All genetic.
And that's why they sought you out. Let me ask you this in closing. People within the community, how have you been received so far?
Very well. Very well. There has been some level of skepticism, but the majority of the people that have conducted their own research on Dulce over, since the stories came about, they know that there is a heavy amount of validity to what this information represents.
Oh, absolutely. You have to be incredibly excited. I know Norio must have been dancing on the ceiling when he heard this interview.
Yeah, and I contacted Norio because of his skeptical nature with regards to the whole Dulce story.
Absolutely. He's a good researcher, and like I said, I was expecting a lot more bravado and drama when he came on the show, and I didn't get it. And that's just how it goes sometimes when you're looking for the truth. Sometimes it's not all that interesting. What I find interesting about you is that you don't talk in generalities. Your book has a lot of detail. So if somebody thinks that you created this whole thing by yourself, you would be one amazing genius of the caliber of anyone who thinks may have faked the MJ-12 documents. And I'm going to leave it there. Anthony Sanchez, Part 1. We're going to cut it here. You've been a great guest, my friend. Tell everybody where to get your book really fast. You got 10 seconds.
Yeah, www.ufohighway.com.
Okay, ufohighway.com. Anthony Sanchez, thank you. That's Part 1. You did a great job. Everyone else, the truth journey continues next Saturday night. You are not going to believe who's going to be on the show. This is Jesse Randolph. You've been listening to UFOnaut Radio on KPAM 860. Have a great weekend. Fair enough, but for the interest of time, let's get back to this facility. Try to describe the picture for us. When I'm thinking of this facility and all the legends and the myths, I mean, you sat down with a guy who spent a lot of time there. I'm thinking underground cities. I'm thinking 7 layers, 7 levels.
That's right.
Right.
It's heavily concealed, and I go into detail as to how the colonel says it was concealed in the book. What I can tell you is that now I personally went off of the eastern slope and did research there, and more recently, Norio Hayakawa
of different floors and biolabs and all kinds
massive in size. That very, very, very massive in size and very, very cavernous. There's an endless number of corridors that actually make up the facility.
So he validated everything I just said, basically, correct?
Absolutely.
How many people work at this facility?
As a matter of fact, last month Norio was out there with his own team, trying to locate the security auxiliary TAD2, which is right there off of County Road. I think it's 375.
Okay,